The close of the Second World War sparked a massive shift in Western demographics. So huge, in fact, that an entire generation has been named after this phenomenon. Today, we're going to be talking about, yes, you guessed it, the baby boom doo 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 baby boom doo doo. Okay, probably a good time to mention that if you never want to hear me sing again, please subscribe to us on Patreon. The link will be at the end of the video. But in all seriousness, the baby boomer generation really is a critical subject in the development and progression of the Cold War, and the world we live in now. I'm your host David, the son of a baby boomer, and this is the Cold War. When the clouds of war cleared after the Second World War, the United States had emerged as one of the globe's military and economic superpowers. Right along with America's rise on the world stage, birth rates at home soared as millions of GIs returned from battlefields scattered across the globe. America's boys came home to a promising economy, overflowing with opportunity, and began to settle down and start families. The babies born in this post-war period, roughly 1945 through 1964, came to be known as the baby boomers. These boomers were the original Cold War kids, as the first of their generation were born right as the conflict between the US and the Soviet Union began to heat up. They would also see the Cold War through to its end, as the generation was beginning to take the reins of power in American society as the communist world fell. Much of their generational experience was formed by the shadow of the Cold War and continues to influence the boomers today, many of whom hold some of America's highest positions of power. To name just two, both US President Donald Trump and 2016 presidential candidate Hillary Clinton are products of this baby boom. Now, in order to understand the boom itself, we need to look at the events leading up to the boom, as well as the events happening at the time. The world had entered a great economic depression at the end of the 1920s and lasting throughout the 1930s. It was, of course, creatively titled the Great Depression. Life was difficult and chocked with uncertainties as work became scarce for many Americans. Naturally, many families held off on having more children as another mouth to feed became a burden rather than a blessing during those tough times. What's more, many young men and women adopted a transient lifestyle, chasing employment that made traditional family life seem out of reach. For example, millions of young men in their prime were tied up with the Civilian Conservation Corps, a New Deal government project to give restless post-adolescents an opportunity to work during these bleak times. Settling down in a stable home and starting a family just wasn't often in the cards, even if they wanted it. When war finally came to the world stage, idleness in America quickly ceased to be a problem. Millions of men, as well as lots of women, were put into uniform and sent abroad, while many more stayed back to man the so-called arsenal of democracy that churned out tanks, planes, bombs, and all the other accoutrements of war in staggering numbers. In only a few short years, America became an industrial marvel of the world, supplying herself and her allies through the Lend-Lease program. While the US was able to fight the war with an untouched home front, things weren't quite as rosy for the rest of the world. When the smoke finally cleared, a lot of the world was in complete shambles, and people were eager to pick up the pieces. Germany, formerly the industrial powerhouse of Europe, had been virtually leveled by the Allied war effort. And certainly in the Soviet and the French zones of occupation, what was left was being stripped and sent home. France itself was crippled, and Great Britain was exhausted, bloody, and spent. I always have a mental image of Great Britain as a marathon runner who didn't train properly for a race and is only finished because his friends picked him up and dragged him the last 5 kilometers. Getting the developed economies of the world back to pre-war levels would take a lot of resources and capital. With local industries in disarray, infrastructure destroyed, and treasuries exhausted, the United States was about the only place still open for business in the world. That same American industrial might that equipped the fighting forces of the Allies would be needed to provide the things that Europe needed to make recovery possible. Dollars from the Marshall Plan for European recovery made their way back to the United States, keeping the industrial machine humming along. If you haven't seen it, you really should watch our episode on that. The Bretton Woods Agreement, made as the war was wrapping up, secured America's position as the guarantor of world trade. With the crumbling of colonial systems accelerating, the power and influence of the major colonial empires, such as Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands, faded. This created an opportunity with the United States able to take advantage of to reach new markets and tap the globe's resources freely as never before. Okay, so here's the summary so far. America was riding high, having achieved victory along with her allies and her newfound economic and political clout in the world. America's GIs would return to a country bursting with possibilities and promise. For many of these returning men, their entire lives up to this point had been little more than poverty or conflict, sometimes both. There were plenty of job opportunities available for the returning servicemen in factories switching from the war industry to industrial and consumer goods to fulfill a global demand. In addition to jobs everywhere, they had access to the GI Bill, paving the way for millions of discharged servicemen to go to college and enter the middle class. For those who may not know, the GI Bill was a benefits package for armed forces personnel returning to civilian life and included low-cost mortgages and business and farm loans and tuition payments, allowing access to further education. Many of these young men would not have had access to the business and education opportunities otherwise without the GI Bill. The home loans returning GIs could access fast-tracked their way to the American dream of homeownership. The landscape of America was rapidly changing as construction exploded all over the newly established suburbs. All this new housing for the returning GIs added fuel to the American economy's fire, and infrastructure spending skyrocketed, lining the pockets of the American worker. The interstate highway system comes to mind as one very prominent example of this. After years of deprivation, the long-neglected American consumer was finally getting a little bit of attention. The same factories that won the war were now being retooled to provide goods to an eager domestic market, flush with cash. GIs returning with little more than their sea bags would need all kinds of things to start life anew. The new houses springing up would need washing machines, refrigerators, and all the modern conveniences American industry could provide. In this climate where optimism soared and all the groundwork was laid for domestic tranquility, America went back to work, making babies. A lot of them. And on a scale reminiscent of how America produced tanks, guns, and planes a few years earlier. By the end of 1946, more or less enough time for a GI to get discharged and spend a little bit of time getting his feet underneath him in the world, there was an average of 350,000 births a year. The birth rate per thousand was 26.6, a sharp contrast from 18.4 during the doldrums of the Great Depression. Now, the economic factors behind the baby boom are very important and all, but we can't dismiss the romantic idea of young men and young women being deprived from each other for so long, finally reunited. Being far from home, and often in the way of danger, made many a GI daydream about coming home to the stable, idyllic comforts of the American home. Perhaps they thought about reading the Saturday Evening Post in front of the fire, while the gal, who didn't sit with anyone else under the apple tree, or at least you hoped, baked a roast in the kitchen with the kids gathered around the radio for Commander Cody. These romantic notions, reminiscent of a Norman Rockwell painting, probably carried many of America's soldiers through the darkest and dullest moments of the war. Combined with the measurable economic factors, this created the perfect baby-making storm in the US. The babies born during the post-war period made their debut in the world at a time when the United States of America seemed nearly invincible. They had won the war, they had the bomb, they were rich and looked to the future. Life seemed great, and it seemed like it could only keep getting better. Increasing prosperity in the average American family, along with the boom in babies, meant that children became big business. Not only did families need things like cribs and bottles, but there was a profit to be made in marketing toys, cereals, and such to children like never before. Now, as I said earlier, this really was the generation of the Cold War. The Cold War was the backdrop of their lives from the cradle until, well, the Soviet Union's grave. In one way or another, these baby boomers lived through the entire conflict and witnessed and even took part in making some profound changes to American society. If you want to get the feel for the Cold War, ask a boomer. The very oldest of the boomers may remember hearing a radio program interrupted by a news bulletin that war was breaking out in a faraway place called Korea. Some of their fathers donned their uniforms one more time and headed overseas to fight again. My own grandfather was one of these men, although he volunteered to go to Germany as part of the occupation force there, just to be sure to avoid going to Korea. We'll talk all about the reasons he may have done that when we get to those episodes on Korea. Many of the first boomers were young, impressionable children during the McCarthy era. While they were probably way more interested in hula hoops and the Lone Ranger, they probably gathered enough from the grown-ups that communists were people you had to watch out for. Better red than dead and all that. They ducked and covered with Bert the Turtle in their classrooms. The threat of atomic and later nuclear weapons always lurked in the background and would shape their thinking on conflict. This was the first generation of Americans in a very long time that dealt with the prospect of an enemy abroad being able to reach out and touch them at home. Their parents certainly knew war, but the boomers had always lived with the fact that if a world war kicked off again, the bombs would be falling on their own homes this time. The boomers were a generation that looked upwards and saw their future in space. Although Sputnik caused a lot of panic in the US, it was a source of wonder at the same time for these kids. There was no shortage of films, comics, toys, and radio programs that reflected the fascination with space. American astronauts became their heroes, and virtually all the boomers remember gathering around the television set on July 20th, 1969 to watch a giant leap for mankind. Many younger boomers weren't old enough to fully register President John F. Kennedy's assassination, but most of them seem to remember their parents crying, or their mothers anyway, but becoming glued to the TV on that fateful day. Just like their fathers did in the Second World War, many boomers answered the call to go fight in another faraway land, this time called Vietnam. On the other hand, many didn't and took to the streets in protest. The Vietnam War caused a massive rift in American society. Many young men came home broken and jaded to an icy reception, a stark contrast from the ticker tape reception their fathers received when they returned from World War II. As if the experience of the Vietnam War wasn't enough, the soul of the boomer generation was rattled by race riots, the Watergate scandal, and an oil embargo all within a handful of years. Bouts of stagflation, deindustrialization, high oil prices, and the frustration of the Iranian hostage crisis caused a crisis of confidence for a generation that strained to see America as the forward-looking, invincible, and exceptional country they knew as children. They watched feebly as the Soviet Union, after years of relative peace, invaded Afghanistan. For the boomers, the world was turned right side up in the 1980s. With the great Cold Warrior, Ronald Reagan, in office, it was morning in America again. Both the economy and the Cold War heated up, and there was a striking resemblance to the social and political climate of their childhood in the 1950s and early 60s. Prosperity was had, and America got to flex her military might again through a massive military buildup. At this point in history, the post-war babies were coming into their stride and taking up positions of leadership in all aspects of American life. They watched as the Berlin Wall fell, and one by one the nations behind the Iron Curtain shed the yoke of communism. After that, it wasn't long before the boomers watched the Soviet Union fizzle out and fall into shambles, leaving America as the world's lone superpower. That generation never knew a world without the formidable Soviet Union and their nuclear arsenal staring them down. Those post-war kids, the baby boomers, truly were a generation steeped in the Cold War. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button. My thanks to Ryan Llewellyn, who provided us with this great script, and make sure to check out his podcast, Cold War Cast. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, if you don't want to hear me sing anymore, consider supporting us via Patreon at www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.